Just two quick points before I begin. One, thunderstorms in May.
Thunderstorms in May.
If that doesn't scream climate change, I don't know what else does. Okay, I do know what else does, but you get what I mean. Number two, guys, I know we're approaching our winter season, but it's actually cold. It's cold. It's cold. It's cold. It's cold. Nyakodola, guys. Nyakodola. And not just in the, you know, pressure cooking under your Aranda blanket kind of way, but also in ways that Uringo Malingozi understands. You know what I mean? Whatever happened to hello? How are you? My name is. What happened to that? What happened to the Mack? What happened to the Mack? So this is a two-part episode because two-part episodes are my spilion. And in this two-part episode, I will be performing an audit on my romantic life, but doing it in a way that not only makes sense for, but supports other aspects of my life, my external as well as my internal world. So I recently did an audit of my romantic life. And the reason why I did this audit is because, you know, I'm in my late 20s, about to enter my 30s, entering a new phase in my life. I've come to new understandings, a new way of living, karmic return, dondoni, etc., etc. And the older I become, the more urgent it is for me to be deliberate about the person that I want to be and the person that I want to show up as in the world. Now, I'm not going to divulge the intimate details of this report because A, is Dima, and B, whatever happened to the art of like mystique. But there is one particular detail in the report that I'd like to share with you all, and the abstract reads as follows. Oaks don't mack anymore. They don't. Okay, what do I mean by that? As I've shared with you guys before, I attached myself to people and jumped into relationships quickly because for a person who's battled self-esteem issues in the ways that I have, I interpret any kind of attention as an invitation and a promise to stay. So what ended up happening is that I would jump to making things official and then sort of like get to know them and date them while we're in the relationship. And don't get me wrong, I know of plenty relationships that end up working out that way. And happily so. Ever heard of dating in your relationship? You know, as a survival and preservation strategy. But I'm not on that. I'm talking about dating before dating. The art of playing the field, that dance of getting to know somebody and living in the thrill of, whether this thing works out or not. And living in the city, this cosmopolitan lifestyle, being stratified and classed in a particular way has really made an unsettling impact on the way that I locate myself in the arena of romance particularly. But I'm also realizing that this way of seeing and framing life has also done a number on y'all, which we will get to. Which is why I am interested and equally excited in having this sort of renewed relationship with courtship and using courtship as a way to live expansively and fruitful of a life as possible, but also using courtship as a way to really participate in the world. You know what I mean? Let's take it back to the beginning. So what I'm about to share with you guys is not unique to the queer experience. It's actually quite common. It's just a little weird for me because I never volunteer this information, but if you ask, I'll tell you. Anyway, my first experience of courtship was with girls. And this is like end of prep, beginning of high school. And the thing about it was, I dated girls I genuinely wanted to be friends with. You know, and in preparation for this episode, I went back and I had conversations with a couple of girls that I dated during that time of my life. And this is what they had to say. When I asked them why they agreed to date me, one of them said she loved my style and my music, so thank you so much. Another one said she particularly enjoyed the way that I opened circles at parties. So I'll interpret that to mean that I am sociable. So again, thank you so much. And another one said she just felt comfortable around me and safe around me and enjoyed the conversations that we had. And you know, I like to think of myself as, you know, clued up, you know, who knows what's up, clever most, you know, who's and I guess to an extent that is true. But what I did not know, or even have like the capacity to know back then, even though intuitively I knew something was not aligning, something was amiss, was that I was under the grip of peer pressure and being socialized to view cis heterosexual relationships as superior, as valuable. So while I knew that I was queer and had very little romantic, if any, romantic feelings or desires towards girls, the status quo at the time said that any guy that wanted to be that close with girls had to date them. Because if you're not dating them, you're definitely getting all the side eyes, all the gossip, the ostracization, etc., etc. And on top of that, it was kind of like this rite of passage into teenagehood to date. So my first experiences of courtship was dating girls because it was socially acceptable. It was a socially acceptable explanation to be that close to them, which is a point I'm going to come back to in my reflection at the end of the episode. And in turn, girls dated me because I was so different from the guys. And I also have to say that even though I was dating girls, I still was queer. The queer does jump out. Being in relationship with girls at the time taught me that laughing and joking and listening and sharing and being vulnerable was so different. When I looked at my relationship with the girls that I dated, it was so different from the relationships that other girls were having with their boyfriends. Traditionally cis heterosexual relationships, which is wild at best and heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking at worst. So now I'm a little older, you know, teenage years. And naturally at that age, the spirit of curiosity and rebellion is alive with every possibility, okay? And even though I didn't think of myself as a rebellious teenager in the greater scheme of things, me merely being deliberate about looking for experiences with other queer people or experiencing queer things made me come across to my peers as rebellious. Like, how wild is that? Like, becoming more of who you are is a revolutionary act. Hilang. Social media is on the come up. And we're sort of, you know, getting the hang of platforms like MySpace and Facebook. Mix it at this stage is like the most important thing in our lives. I remember, you know, you had your little name that you switched up like every month or so, and the amount of airtime that you'd spend buying moolah. And don't get me started on those themes. Like, Playboy and Playgirl, those are the best themes. I said what I said. And the thing about the rise of social media at the time was this unprecedented access we had to the world, we had with other people, strangers. And through that access, we had the freedom to create and curate our lives, our stories, our identities in ways never imagined, never done before. So here I am as a teenager in this new world of social media, and I get to experience myself as a queer person for the first time. And my first encounter with the world of queer things were the chat rooms of yeah, the chat rooms of Mix It and Make 33. The first thing that struck me about this world and this experience, this first time experience, experiencing myself as a queer being, was that a good majority, and when I say a good majority, I really mean like 90% of my online interactions and the content that I was consuming was purely sexual. And that still is the case now, maybe to a little lesser extent, but I'm gonna come back to that. And so it was cemented in my developing mind and in my identity formation as a queer being that you can't be queer and therefore valid if you're not sexual. The second thing that struck me was this kind of silent, acceptable standard of interaction that was very casual, very short. And by that I mean it was acceptable to not really treat one another with just a basic level of respect and decency unless there was a promise of the interaction actually leading to something. You see a lot of bios talking about, don't bore me, get to the point, I'm not your cousin, stuff like that. And I get it, small talk can be tedious and unnecessary. But is it that or a symptom of trying to cope with the fast-paced development in interactive technology and modern life in general? Right, we in our 20s, the roaring 20s, early 20s. I'm going to talk about the early 20s. The late 20s. The late 20s deserves an episode of its own. That's what's going to come up in part 2. Yes, they were roaring. So I'm in my early 20s, and I'm actively dating. I joined strong, man. And this is where the power of social media in being able to shape a young mind comes into play. This is where the legacy of social media catches up with me. Remember, my first experience fully as a queer person was sexual in nature, and that was the expectation that I had in my mind. So now I'm dating, and not only do I find it challenging to interact with people if there isn't a perceivable sense of sexual tension, but I'm also depriving myself of what it looks like to be in relationship with people that does not involve sex. So in a relationship or in any interaction, sex takes precedence, right? Sex becomes the way that I recognized and become recognizable. It becomes the way that I measure value and how value is measured for myself. Sex becomes coded in literally every aspect of the relationship. Sex is in the language. It's in the language we use to communicate. So when Ubuntu Bam catches up eventually and I start to lose interest in sex, also in ways that I don't healthily understand, that was usually the beginning of the end of my relationships. And because of that, I also then realized that during that time of my life, my early 20s, I dated a whole lot of people. But I wasn't doing much dating. You're friends with Hans? Awamunna. How dare ye? How dare. There are a couple of things that dating girls back then has taught me about courtship and also being in the kind of relationships that I look forward to being in and being in the kind of relationships that I quite frankly deserve. What I know now that I didn't know back then is just how important friendship is. Not just in a relationship, a romantic relationship, but all relationships, especially especially in courtship. Guys, there's friendship in courtship, as well as there's courtship in all other relationships, right? Because in friendship, you find values such as fun and laughter and respect and grace and safety and the holding of space in times of discomfort and difficulty. Another thing that I learned in dating girls is just the sheer but almost undetectable power of peer pressure and socialization, which, one is the symptom of the other. And the ability for those things to rob you of who you are, but also robbing other people of their ability to have and to hold space for you for exactly who you are. And being who you are is the greatest thing you could ever be. Ask me, I'll tell you. And to add on to that, actually, I, through experiencing, socialization and peer pressure in the way that I've described it in this episode, it makes me realize just how committed people are to uniformity. Like, we're committed to uniformity more than we would like to admit or even realize. And we're terrified of difference. And because we've been socialized to fear things and people and experiences that are different from us, it disempowers us from navigating difference productively and positively. Which is why courtship, I call it the dance of life, really. Courtship being a strategy to live beyond what I know is so important. Because it really is in that dance with difference, in this context, that you truly get to discover the things that are for you, with you, about you, and the things that are not. And the things that are not, you set a standard, you accept them for what they are, and you move on. Now let me tell you about the analog boy in a digital world. Navigating the internet as young as I was, and as a young queer person as I was at that time, was so dangerous. Simply because there was no safe, productively regulated space for me to understand myself and subsequently enjoy myself as a sexual being. There was no productive sex education in school. The topic is taboo at home, and there weren't easy or obvious avenues of access to information about sexual identity and sexual health, and navigating the world as a sexual being, not in the ways that exist now. And I always knew somewhere in my intuition that I could not relate and therefore show up as a sexual being at the time in ways that others were showing up, or let me also say in ways that was considered normal. But because of my age at the time, society expected me to be this horny teenager, coupled with the oaks who were chatting crazy to me in the chat rooms. I performed being this sexual being. In fact, I performed being this hypersexual being, because that is what is not only acceptable, but that is how society assigns value to you. And the consequences of that were, one, a denial and a delay of who I really am or who I really was sexually. It really wasn't until now that I'm discovering myself as a sexual being, discovering what turns me on, what turns me off, what makes me feel safe and what doesn't, what kind of person I'm compatible with, and under what circumstances I'm compatible with that person. Just what makes sense to me and for me, and how does it contribute to the greater story of who I am? And also understanding that sex comes in so many different forms, and that all those forms are valid, whether or not they are for me. And number two, knowing that I can just flat out express disinterest and say no without feeling like I'm betraying humanity. And to wrap part one of this episode up, the roaring 20s, the early 20s that I was talking about earlier on. I look back on my early 20s and I identify moments of great joy and pleasure and pride, but I also identify moments that make my heart heavy. You know, I realized that I showed up to particularly my romantic relationships, trying to be somebody I thought I had to be. Remember when I said I was dating a whole lot of people without doing a whole lot of dating? I did so much dating because I had difficulty, or just like didn't have the wherewithal and the confidence and the grounding and the grace of just showing up just the way that I was. I spent so much of my time with the people that I dated trying to be acceptable and perceivable and agreeable. And I totally understand that these lessons are such that, you know, they come with age and experience and maturity. But the thing that makes me want to take courtship seriously is the fact that I look back on my early 20s and my dating life, and I just wish I took the time out to get to know my partners better, really. Because I feel like had I taken that time to do the work of getting to know them and affording them the courtesy of getting to know me, and when I say getting to know, I mean truly getting to know and not showing up for each other because we think that's the right thing to do, I think a lot of those relationships would have turned out differently. But we live and we learn and we grow, and that's why we're here. So in the next episode, I carry on this conversation about courtship and how I've been deliberate about courtship playing a significant role in me living a more expansive life, a more richer life. And I'm going to foreground that conversation in how I organized 12 dates only for one to materialize.